So thinking about society's changing attitudes on experimentation and thinking about context, the first thing I wanted to do was look back historically and find out what kinds of things we've done. And so for those of you who aren't really familiar with human experimentation, you might be surprised that we've done some pretty terrible things. So a couple of examples of the kinds of ethical issues in human rights and in human experimentation. There's different kinds of human rights violations. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are some examples. Biological human rights violations, things like giving medical surgeries to people without their consent, doing surgical experimentation, so just trying to poke around and see what happens. There are a lot of examples of enslaved women being operated on experimentally. So, you know, if they had a cold, well, let's see if we take out the spleen, if that will fix the cold, those sorts of things. And oftentimes without anesthesia, so they weren't even, you know, ethical surgeries. Also things like infection or transfer of pathogens or diseases purposefully. So if you're not familiar with the Tuskegee experiment that Dr. Nixon mentioned, that was where people were purposefully given syphilis just so that we could try different things to see if anything would cure it. And in some cases, people were not cured purposefully because we wanted to see how long it would take before they would die, right? So really awful. Other examples, chemical human rights violations, things like testing chemical warfare on people to see how that would work. I found an interesting example that hit sort of close to home in the 1950s. Tampa Bay was the victim of a study where whooping cough was released into the public to see how quickly it would spread. So I think 12 people died from that experiment. Psychological human rights violations, things like the Stanford prison experiments where people were tortured purposefully or they were treated inhumanely just to see how they would react. And then pharmacological examples, things like testing medication on people to see if it works or if it causes more harm than good. So those are some examples of the kinds of violations we have seen historically. And so understanding that context, I wanted to think about what has changed, right? Because my question was about how has society's attitudes changed. And I thought certainly our attitudes have changed, right? I mean, if we look at these historical things that we've seen, certainly we've changed. So I found some of the regulations that we have created as a society in the last several decades. Things like the Nuremberg Code, which said, you know, if you're going to have human subjects participating in your experiments, you have to get their permission first. Seems like common sense, but that was in 1947. And also, you can't coerce people. So, you know, if you say something like, it's totally up to you if you want to participate, but if you don't, we won't let you out of prison, right? That's coercion, so that doesn't work. The Declaration of Helsinki in the 1960s, which was really specifically about medical ethics. So don't do tests on people if the tests are more likely to hurt them. And then the Code of Federal Regulations in 1975, that was the first time that the federal government said, you know, there should probably be a board of people that review these studies and make sure that they're going to be ethical. So if you're receiving federal funds, like USF does sometimes for research, you have to have approval by this board. And so looking at these changes, I thought, well, certainly we've become more ethical, right? We had all of these awful violations. And then we've got these regulations and these changes that are telling us we're starting to care a little bit more about the people that are our participants. But I started looking a little deeper and thinking a little more about that. And I found some interesting parallels, okay? So I'm kind of asking the question, are we really becoming more ethical, or are we just becoming anti-liability, right? Do we really care more about the people, or are we really just trying to make sure we don't get in trouble for what we do?